2. My topic tonight is divorce and remarriage. And I want to remind you that our angle for this class is the simple equation: Christian sexual ethics, which is the name of this class, is biblical sexual ethics. So the question is not what position on divorce is palatable. The question is not what's convenient for me. The question is not what fits in with our modern sensibilities, but the question is, well, what does the Bible say? And so that's what I want to do. I want to look at 3 scriptures from the Old Testament and 3 scriptures from the New Testament. And to start, I want to look at Malachi chapter 2, verse 13. So we'll turn there to begin. And we read, and I'm going to be kind of cruising along because there's a lot of material. You see that I have a lot of pages in my notes for today. I've been researching this for a long time, for many years actually, and it's a topic that I kind of always have on the back burner. I always want to hear people's perspectives on it because it is such a controversial subject. And I've read a lot of what other Christians who are interested in this subject have to say, and I try to give you footnotes, so if you're interested, you can look up those resources on your own and continue the investigation. But what I share with you, I try to share as biblically as possible. So, because I'm not the guru, I don't have the answer to every conundrum, to every possible scenario. And my authority is really based on what the Bible says. And if the Bible's wrong, then I'm wrong. If the Bible's right, then I'm right. And that's just where I choose to stand. So, Malachi 2:13 says, "This is another thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with groaning, because He no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand." So God is not in a good place with His people, or to say it a better way, the people are not in a good place with God. They're making offerings, and He's not regarding them. God is not accepting the worship of His people, which in this period of time would be probably animal sacrifice and grain offerings, that sort of thing. Verse 14, "Yet you say, for what reason?" Well, you want to know? Here's the answer. Malachi will tell you. "Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. But not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth." Verse 16, "For I hate divorce."
And I hate. Sorry, I'm getting a radio signal. Just give me 3 seconds.
John, 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. What God says here is that He hates divorce. There's a translational issue. I give you a long, complicated footnote if you want to read it. But the NASB and the NET both say, "I hate divorce," and some other translations take it in a different way. But the point is still clear what's going on here. In antiquity, women, especially divorced women, were vulnerable. Because the way a patriarchal society works is you go from being under your father's care, under your father's protection, to being a part of your husband's household. And if he sends you out because you got old, or because you burned the toast, or because you got in an argument, and he's like, well, I've got all the power here because women didn't have the right to divorce, and a man sends her out, he can just upgrade to another woman. And that's what Malachi is rebuking the people for. Men were dealing treacherously with the wives of their youth. We have this today, right? Where somebody divorces their wife and then marries some young girl, right? This is nothing new under the sun here. And God says, look, you can't do that and expect it to be okay with me. God will not regard your offering. You can offer God $1 million, but if you're dealing treacherously with the wife of your youth, He doesn't want it. That's what Malachi said. Of course, they wouldn't use dollars in his time. And so it says, "For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel," verse 16, "and him who covers his garment with wrong, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously." God says He hates divorce. The second scripture is in Deuteronomy. Flip over, please, to Deuteronomy we're going to bypass this one and go to chapter 24. I'll just summarize for you what chapter 22 says. It's a law that protects a virtuous woman from getting divorced. If her husband falsely accuses her of premarital sex, he will get whipped, fined, and barred from divorcing her the rest of his life. So that's something that apparently was a loophole for some guys, where they're like, well, I want to divorce my wife, and they were looking for a reason. They said, oh, well, she had premarital, she wasn't a virgin on her wedding night. And so that was something that would happen. So there's a law here in Deuteronomy 22 that says, okay, well, if it turns out and there's evidence of her virginity that her father would keep, and it's a bit complicated, but if it turned out that he was lying, he's going to get whipped. I mean, this is really something. He gets whipped, he gets fined, and then he's never allowed to divorce her for the rest of his life. Doesn't matter what she does. Which, if you think about it, it's quite a punishment, because they're not in a good, happy relationship after he's falsely accused her of not being a virgin, right? And so that's something. And then if she was found out to have not been a virgin at marriage, I probably should have read this in our premarital time together when we were looking at that subject. She would be stoned. She would be executed. She would get the capital punishment for that. So that shows you how seriously they took the subject of virginity and premarital sex. But I don't want to get too much into that, because chapter 24 has really got to be our focus, more or less, for the rest of our time here. Because everything after Deuteronomy 24 is just interpreting what it said. Even what Jesus says. It's really, Deuteronomy 24 is right there in the background. Chapter 24, verse 1 says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. There's so much in here. I can't deal with it all, but no boomerang wives. Right? I mean, if you send her out, you divorce her, you can take her back. But if you send her out and then she marries somebody else, that's it. You can't take her back again. You can't boomerang that situation around, right? That's really what this is talking about. However, our focus is verse 1. And that just a couple of little words there, and that makes all the difference in the world, it turns out. Let me read it again. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, so that's one key part, right? She finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her. And he writes her a certificate of divorce, and so on. Okay? So a lot of this turns on this word ervat, which is the word for nakedness in Hebrew. Translated indecency here. Do you see that in verse 1? Because he has found some indecency in her. Okay? So before I get to that, let me just mention the whole idea of a certificate of divorce, I want to say this first, was a huge step forward for women and women's rights in ancient Israel, because it gave her a defined status in the society. Because in the modern term they use for that is a get, G-E-T, a get. And that is a document that says this woman's divorced, and if she's divorced, she has a certificate of divorce, then she's free to remarry. And that's just the way that whole system worked. And you see that is just assumed here. If he sends her out with a certificate of divorce and she gets remarried, there's no debate about it. It's just like, yeah, if you did have that divorce, then you could remarry. It's not even debated here. Now, this word ervat, which is in the ESV and the NASB translated some indecency, in the Jewish Publication Society Bible is translated something obnoxious. So if he finds something obnoxious in her, he can divorce her. You're out for that one, huh?
I'm gonna be out.
Let me get my pen working here. All right, so that's obnoxious. King James says some uncleanness, right? And then the NET, New English Translation, says something offensive. And the NRSV says objectionable. What's so fascinating, why this is so, to me at least, confusing, is that the exact Hebrew phrase is ervat davar. And ervat means nakedness, and davar means word. It's just the Hebrew word for word. And so, just like in Greek, the word word can mean not just a word, but also a thing. So that's why they're getting this idea of something, right? So it's not just like a naked word, which should be a literal translation. The translators are saying, well, it's some indecency, it's something. And so the word nakedness in the Hebrew leans us towards the idea that there's probably something sexual going on here. But like I showed you, none of these translations, this is a wide range of translations, go with nakedness here. And I find that utterly fascinating. My knowledge of Hebrew is way too limited to weigh in on which way that should be translated, but the rabbis argued about it. And so they wanted to know, what precisely does ervat mean? In other words, what is the cause for which I can divorce my wife? That's what they want to argue about. So we have three perspectives in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a document after the time of the New Testament, but records some that was before the time of Jesus. And they give three opinions, one from Hillel, who lived a generation before Christ, one from Shammai, who lived during the time of Christ, and one from Akiva, who lived a generation after Christ. These are three Jewish rabbis. And this is Tractate Gittin 90a, which is part of this Jewish code called the Babylonian Talmud. Mishnah. The house of Shammai says, so this is the Shammai interpretation on ervat, a man should not divorce his wife unless he has found her guilty of some unseemly conduct. So Shammai is taken as unseemly conduct, very literally. As it says, because he has found some unseemly thing in her. The house of Hillel, however, says that he may divorce her even if she has merely spoiled his food. Since it says he hath found some unseemly thing in her. Look, if you're waiting for dinner and it's spoiled, it's burnt, that's unseemly. Right, gentlemen? So that's... I'm joking, just to be clear. That's Hillel. That's what Hillel is saying. And that's the Jewish rabbi before the time of Christ. Shammai says it's got to be something that's unseemly in her. And then Akiva, he's really bad. Right? Akiva says he may divorce her even if he finds another woman more beautiful than she is. She doesn't even have to mess up dinner. As it says, it comes to pass if she find no favor in his eyes. So just to summarize, Shammai says some unseemly conduct. That's what ervat is. Hillel says she spoiled the food. And Akiva says you found someone better. You found someone more attractive. So these are, and this is not a joke, these are three actual ancient Jewish interpretations from around the time of Jesus. And I asked our Jewish instructor, our Hebrew instructor, what is the position on divorce? And she said, it's something that's accepted. And I looked online and I found some stuff I'll share with you in a minute. But the question is, who's your rabbi? Are those your rabbis? And for us as Christians, the real question is, how did Jesus interpret Deuteronomy 24? I mean, these guys, they don't have authority over us. I mean, they're funny, I think. Or sad, depending on how you look at it, right? But what does Jesus say? So let's look at Jesus. We're going to look at three scriptures in the New Testament. Matthew 5:31. I've got this up on the screen for you, but we're going to go to Matthew 19 in just a second. So go ahead and turn over to Matthew 19. Matthew 5:31 is part of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's very quick. A lot of the little antitheses where Jesus says, you have heard it was said, but I say it to you, they have a number of verses to them. This was only 2 verses. It's very short, very quick, and then he moves on to the next topic. So verse 31, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that, so this right here is a quotation from Deuteronomy 24, verse 1.
So Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. It's like, you heard it was said, if you whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, now that's interesting, right? What is he going to say? Everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, so that's what we call the exception clause, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So who is Jesus most like? Is he like Shammai? Is he like Hillel? Is he like Akiva? Well, honestly, he's stricter than all three. I mean, Shammai left it pretty nebulous, some unseemly thing. Hillel said she burned dinner. Akiva said you found somebody more attractive. Jesus is like, look, unless it's sexual immorality, you're committing adultery by moving on to another woman. So the question is, well, what is adultery? We just heard what adultery is. Adultery is where one or both of those involved in that relationship, in that sexual intercourse, are married. One or both are married, and they're not married to each other, right? We know what this means. However, that's really a key for understanding the way this exception clause works here, okay? Because the second part of it says, let's just take the exception out of it. Everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Let's look at the last part. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. On face value, that doesn't make any sense. A divorced woman can't commit adultery. She's not married. Only married people can, at least on her end, she can't commit adultery if she's no longer married, if she's divorced, right? So how do we resolve this? Well, there has to be some sense in which she's still married. You can't, unmarried people can't commit adultery. They can commit fornication, they can do all kinds of other things, but adultery is reserved for married people. And so, in some sense, unless it was for sexual immorality that the divorce happened, as far as God's concerned, these people are still married. And I don't want to go too much into detail on that, but I want to show you this from a website called Judaism, or it's called JewFAQ.org. This is a very generic website by this lady, Tracy Rich, who is an Orthodox Jew. And she's not a rabbi or an authority figure, but she's just like writing down what is the tradition, how do we do things, just like educating people on what Judaism is on a basic level. And I found this totally fascinating. She said, it is important to note that a civil divorce, this is according to Orthodox Judaism, there are three branches. There's conservative, Reformed, and Orthodox. So Orthodox is the more Bible-based out of those three, or the more conservative, whatever you want to call it. It is important to note that the civil divorce is not sufficient to dissolve a Jewish marriage. As far as Jewish law is concerned, a couple remains married until the woman receives the get. This has been a significant problem. Many liberal Jews have a religiously valid marriage. In other words, they went to the rabbi and it was in the synagogue and all the rest when they got married. Yet, they do not obtain a religiously valid divorce. So you get married in the synagogue, but when you want to get divorced, they don't go to the rabbi, they go to the governmental authorities. Okay, that's what she's talking about. If the woman remarries after such a procedure, her second marriage is considered an adulterous one, and her children are considered manzarim, which I take it as a bad word. It means bastards or illegitimate. This is a modern Jewish understanding of divorce and remarriage. And now, they don't have a Jesus, right? So they're not looking at it the same way we are. They're just looking at Deuteronomy 24, certificate of divorce, the get. For them, that's still considered the way you do it. And look at Matthew 19. Let's see what happened when the Pharisees came up and asked Jesus about this. And they sort of interrogated him. And they popped this question to Jesus in Matthew 19:3. It says, and the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Any cause sounds suspiciously like no fault. Yeah. Divorce, which is what we have today. So the Pharisees asked Jesus to weigh in on the debate. Verse 4, he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. There's Genesis 2:24 again. We see this over and over and over throughout this class, that a man leaves, he cleaves, and he's one flesh with his wife. He leaves his parents' house, he cleaves to his wife, and they are one flesh. Now, what's so cool about what Jesus says when they tie the knot is that God has joined together. Did you see that in verse 6? What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. In marriage, God does something. It's not just the two people making a commitment with their words or signing a document for the government, and it's not just the witnesses in the room, and it's not just the officiant authorized by the government or the pastor or the priest or whatever. God's there. And from Jesus' perspective, he says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So in the consummation of the marriage, God joins the people together. There's a spiritual thing that happens. I mean, we know there's a physical thing that happens, right? This is Christian sexual ethics. We understand that. But there's also a spiritual aspect to this, that God joins them together. And so Jesus is saying, well, look, if God joins them together, who are you guys? What are you? Humans are going to tear this apart? So you have to understand the angle they're approaching Jesus at. The angle is, can we divorce for any cause? And Jesus is like, divorce? What's wrong with you knuckleheads? Right? He's saying, divorce. God joined these people together. You're going to split them apart? What's wrong with you? You're just a human. So then, of course, they come back. Like a good Jewish discussion, they're like, what about the ervat? What about Deuteronomy 24? Verse 7, they said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce, the get, and to send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart. Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So Jesus here draws a distinction between permitting and commanding. It says that God they said, well, Moses commanded. Jesus said, God allowed it. He allowed it. It's not a command. He's allowing you guys to get divorced. But he recognizes that it's legitimate. Jesus is not contradicting it either. He is just limiting it. Like the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus clarifies that the ervat, which is translated indecency in the ESV and the NASB, is porneia, which is a Greek word we looked at before when we talked about premarital sex. And that's the word translated sexual immorality, unchastity, or fornication. So for what's called the exception clause, that's like when you actually can get a divorce according to Jesus, and then presumably also get remarried, we have three possible interpretations. And honest-hearted Christians take all three of these positions. There are different people, scholars and so on, that argue for these. The first is that porneia here refers to adultery. The second is that it refers to premarital sex, like in Deuteronomy 22. You find out she's not a virgin on the wedding day, then you would be allowed to divorce her. Or the last option is based on Leviticus 18, which talks about all these family relations, incest, or you're marrying your relatives, that sort of thing. And that would be grounds for divorce. What I told you last time was based on the Greek lexicon, standard Greek lexicon, the BDAG. The word porneia means unlawful sexual intercourse. It does not mean only adultery, premarital sex, or incest. It would apply to all those, plus a whole bunch of other things that would come under the broad category of sexual misbehavior or misconduct, right? Richard Hayes, I found his take on this to be pretty helpful. He writes, finally, any interpretation of the exception clause must do justice to the very general meaning of porneia in contemporary Greek usage. A lot of times what people do is they're studying the Bible, and what they'll do is they'll look at how the word was used just in the New Testament. Well, you can a lot of times get some insight that way, but the New Testament did not exist in a vacuum. I mean, there were tons of other Greek documents that were also written around that time that we have access to today. And so what does the word mean in general is a question. And then Does it have a specific meaning in the New Testament, or are they just using it the way you use it in general? And what he's saying is that you have to take into consideration the contemporary Greek usage of that word. It's a generic term for all sorts of, and this is his term, sexual misconduct. Unless the immediate context provides some good reason for limiting its sphere of application, it ought to be construed as a catch-all term, not as a terminus technicus for one specific offense, which is a Latin phrase meaning technical term. You can show off to your friends like, oh, that's a terminus technicus, isn't it? You know? Technical term. He's like, look, pornea is not a technical term. It just means sexual misconduct. Thus, the best interpretation is that the Matthean, which is Matthew's, exception clause leaves the door open for divorce on the grounds of a variety of offenses related to sexual immorality. The new element here that Jesus brings in Matthew 19, however, is the assertion that the man who divorces his wife makes her into an adulteress, and that the person who marries a legally divorced woman also is committing adultery. Presumably, the logic is that a certificate of divorce has no real effect. The marriage remains in force. If the divorced woman remarries, as she might have to do for legal and economic protection, she will thereby de facto commit adultery against the original husband who dismissed her, and the man who marries her will also be committing adultery against the first husband. The effect of this teaching is to declare that the Deuteronomic divorce law null and void except in cases of pornea. So going back to Deuteronomy 24, what's the ervat there? What's that indecency? According to Jesus, it's pornea, which is this broad term for sexual immorality, which would include adultery, obviously. So let's keep going here. I've got a lot more to say in only so many minutes. On remarriage, some argue that sexual immorality allows for divorce, but not remarriage. Okay? Take a look at that again. Matthew 19, verse, 6? Sheet over here, because I didn't think I would go back to it. What does Jesus say there? I'm on the wrong page. All right, well.
It's 19:9.
Oh, okay. 19, verse 9. There it is. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So, some people are saying, okay, you can get divorced for sexual immorality, but you can't get remarried. Other people are saying, well, if it's a divorce, then you can get remarried. And so there are different points of view on this. But look, if a divorce is legitimate, no longer married. That's my point. The marriage is no longer in force. If it's legitimate, I'm not talking about just legally here. I'm talking about in God's eyes. If God, these are God's laws we're talking about here. So if God says, except for this exception, and then Jesus later on clarifies that's sexual immorality of whatever kind, then those people are divorced. If you are actually divorced, you cannot commit adultery anymore. You just can't do it. You're not married. Adultery is for married people. So I would argue for remarriage as a possibility in that case. Certainly not mandatory, but possible. So putting together what Jesus says in all four of the Gospels, and I realize I didn't read to you Mark and Luke, but I'm just going to add them in this chart here. We have these four general principles. One, a husband who divorces his wife, except for pornea, makes her commit adultery, presumably because she'd have to get remarried in order to survive in that culture. Number two, a man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Number three, a husband who divorces his wife, except for pornea, commits adultery. So on the one, it says the husband makes the wife commit adultery if you marry a divorced woman, but what about the guy who divorced her? Can he get away with it? Well, in Matthew 19, Jesus gives it back to him as well. A husband who divorces, so he's covering every different angle of this thing. It's a bit complicated, but he commits adultery against her, is what Mark 10:11 says, which is totally progressive, considering that they didn't think that women had equal value a lot of times in their society. But Jesus is recognizing, no, you can commit adultery against her, that she does have that right, that dignity. Then number 4, a wife who divorces her husband and remarries commits adultery. So, and that's Mark 10:12. So we have all the different scenarios filled in there. I love verse 10, what the disciples said to Jesus. I mean, I don't love it. I think it's funny. They said, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. Jesus, if it's like this, maybe I'll just stay single. But he said to them, not everyone can receive the saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been made so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. So the disciples are shocked. They say, well, maybe she wouldn't get married. Well, yeah. If you're looking for a way out before you get married, you shouldn't get married. That's right. Like, if you're thinking like, all right, well, if she's not a good cook or whatever, like, no, you shouldn't get married. But if you recognize the Genesis 2:24 aspect, the creation theology undergirding the biblical understanding of marriage, that it's a man and a woman, that they are apart from their parents, they cleave to each other, and that God unites them together, then, and that what God has joined together, let no human separate, then yeah, get married and don't look for a back door. So Jesus talks about these eunuchs. I just review that ever so quickly. You can go over to 1 Corinthians 7. We need to definitely hit that scripture because it's super relevant. On the eunuch aspect here, Jesus says there are 3 categories. Someone who cannot have intercourse because of a birth defect, that's some eunuchs. Others are someone who's castrated or injured by others. And then number 3 is someone who chooses to live chastely for the kingdom. That would be somebody who's choosing singleness. And Jesus says, only to those to whom it is given. So you get a sense of calling when it comes to marriage, when it comes to singleness. And that's a very different way of looking at it than we have today. But as we see here in 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul assumes that that's the case. That you're called to things, that where you're at is where God wants you to be. And otherwise, he'll let you know. So look at 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10. To the married, I give this charge. This is the Apostle Paul. This is one of these very interesting moments in his epistle here where he quotes Jesus. Right? To the married, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, isn't that great? It's like, don't do it. But if you do... This is what happens next. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. So this is the Apostle Paul, so far as I could tell, paraphrasing what Jesus had said. We read what Jesus had said. This is the same thing, but in different words. That's why I say paraphrasing. In Jesus' context, everyone's Jewish. In the Apostle Paul's context, he's writing to the Corinthians, there are a lot of mixed marriages. If you are a convert to Christianity and your spouse is a pagan idol worshiper, what do you do? In that case, are you bound to that person still? Or you have freedom in Christ? You can just go off and do whatever you want. That's a question that is very much alive for them. And so, verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. This is really kind of a funny chapter too, because he's speaking on his own authority here, the apostle is. He says, I, not the Lord. And then at the end of the chapter, he says, and I think I too have the Spirit of God. Which is just kind of a different kind of chapter than a lot of other ones. But he's dealing with a very sensitive issue. He's navigating it. He's bringing them along, right? To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman, and he does it both ways, right? Any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife. And the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. This is the idea of contagious holiness. I love that. You would think it's the other way, that the pagan would contaminate the Christian. Yeah. The Apostle Paul says, no. Holiness is powerful. Holiness can spread. It can contaminate them, right? And he's like, look, one godly person can sanctify the whole family. It's really a powerful statement. Verse 15, but, here's real life again, right? Sometimes the unbelieving partner separates. So what do you do then? If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. The literal translation there is bound, is not bound. God has called you to peace. So he says to them, you can see how against divorce he is. He's like, don't get divorced. If you get divorced, stay unmarried or work it out. Come back together, reconcile. But if they leave and there's nothing you can do about it, and we have this today in New York State divorce law that one party can initiate a divorce and there's literally nothing you can do to stop that. At a certain point, it doesn't matter if you sign the documents or not, the court will grant the divorce. It does not take mutual consent under the current laws that we have. And he says, look, if that happens, you have an unbelieving partner that separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not bound. God has called you to peace. That's something, huh? And then I love this, verse 16. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? I know they're an unbeliever. I know they're worshiping the pagan gods. I know they're an idol worshiper, right? But how do you know that by your Christian witness you can't turn the tide the other way? If the unbeliever separates, let him go. But look, he's not overturning what Jesus said. He's very conscious in starting with the words of Jesus. He's like, look, this is what it says, not I, but the Lord. If you, what does he say? Look at that verse again. Verse 11. Did you catch that one? That's a key verse for us. Verse 11. Somebody read that. What did that say?
But even if she does depart.
Or no, verse 10. Verse 10.
Oh. Now for the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband.
Right. Depart, separate, divorce. These are all very synonymous terms. But if she does, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. He's not contradicting himself here. He's saying, look, if it happens, it happens. Don't you be the initiator of it, but let it happen. Now, according to Jesus, we do have that exception clause. That's clear, right? That if there is sexual immorality, you can be the initiator of the divorce, and then it would be a lawful divorce in the eyes of God. And that if it is a lawful divorce in the eyes of God, you would be allowed to remarry. The other case would be if the spouse dies, you would be allowed to remarry. Everybody agrees on that, ancient and modern. Well, except for the Hindus. I think the Hindus don't believe that, but we're not Hindus. Verse 17, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him. There's that idea of calling. Right? Jesus says, to whom it has been given. The Apostle Paul says, this is, the Lord has assigned him that kind of life. This is my rule in all the churches. Look at verse 27. We're going to come back to the rest of this chapter later. But verse 27 says, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think I too have the Spirit of God. So what's the law in New York State? In New York State, in the United States, by 1977, 9 states had adopted no-fault divorce laws. And by late 1983, every state but South Dakota and New York had adopted some form of no-fault divorce. South Dakota adopted no-fault divorce in 1985. Until August 2010, New York, which is where we are right now, still lacked a unilateral no-fault divorce statute. You think New York is so progressive, right? It's the last state of the 50 to approve no-fault divorce. Only if both parties notarized a separation agreement and lived separately for 1 year could a judge convert it into a divorce. New York Governor David Paterson, this is all according to Wikipedia, signed a no-fault divorce bill on August 15, 2010. As of October 2010, which would be 7 years ago, no-fault divorce is allowed in all 50 states and in the District of Columbia. So divorce is you don't have to prove that one of the parties breached the contract of marriage. You don't have to prove infidelity. You don't have to prove cruelty, abandonment, anything. You can just say we have unreconcilable or irreconcilable differences, and that can get the job done. Compared to what we see today, which is what we just read, Jesus' words are startling and controversial. They are. But remember, his own contemporaries 2,000 years ago, Shammai, Hillel, Akiva, he would have been controversial to them 2,000 years ago. We expect him to fit in today? We cannot go against what the Bible says if our goal is to practice biblical sexual ethics. We dare not call Jesus Lord and refuse to obey his words. The question is, what's your standard? Is it New York State law? Is it Jewish law? Is it Hillel? Is it Shammai? Is it Akiva? Or is it Jesus? I think it needs to be Jesus. I don't want to, at the end of the day, I understand life is complicated, and in our broken world we have innumerable, difficult quandaries. And like I said, I'm not a guru to tell you exactly how to handle every situation. But whatever we do, we don't want to defy Jesus. We don't want to cast his words aside and count them as irrelevant or outdated. Because then what are we standing on? We've just cut the branch we're sitting on. And then there's nothing beneath us. Jesus doesn't ever sugarcoat Christianity either. Right? He says, if you want to follow me, take up your cross. Be willing to die. I mean, Christianity is serious. It's not like a little add-on to our lives. But at the same time, we don't want to become the Pharisees who are quibbling over some nuance of the law and saying and being judgmental and making all these other rules on top of what Jesus said. Right? We want to. And the great sin of the Pharisees, more than anything else, is they didn't care about the person. They cared about the rules, not the person. And we don't want to become like that either. Amen. Right? We want to be, Jesus does this. He gives us this rule. But then you look at the rest of his example, he carries himself with grace. He carries himself with compassion and forgiveness. Right? So we want to be able to strike that balance like he did. And I think, there's a lot of what ifs, and it's like the question of domestic abuse comes up. Well, what about somebody's getting beat up? Well, look, if you're getting beat up, get out of that situation. Just get out of it, clear your head, figure out a game plan for what to do. But don't stay in the house. You know what I mean? That just doesn't make it. How is that going to lead that person to Christ? Oh, come beat me up again. You know what I mean? Like that's not at all in keeping with the spirit of this. Come up with a game plan, get some of God's wisdom on how to handle that situation. And in studying this and looking at this, I realize I'm way over time, but I just really want to say this. I'm particularly concerned about those who are not yet married, not just those of you in the room, but those who are watching this live and then later. It matters who you pick to be your spouse. It matters a great deal. Look, if you pick a violent man, don't be surprised if he hits you later. Right? If you pick if you pick a drug addict woman, don't be surprised if she's using drugs when she's pregnant with your child. You got to use a little sense here that the person we want to pick needs to be somebody that is godly, somebody that cares about God more than you. And if you do that, you've got a shot at it. Stanley Hauerwas talks about this myth in our generation that you get married to fulfill your dreams. He says, destructive to marriage is the self-fulfillment ethic that assumes marriage and the family are primarily institutions of personal fulfillment, necessary for us to become whole and happy. The assumption is that there is someone just right for us to marry, and that if we look closely enough, we will find the right person. How many times have you seen that in a Disney movie? The moral assumption overlooks a crucial aspect to marriage. It fails to appreciate the fact that we always marry the wrong person. We never know whom we marry. We just think we do. Or even if we first marry the right person, just give it a while, and he or she will change. For marriage, being the enormous thing it is, means we are not the same person after we have entered into it. The primary problem is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom you find yourself married. Right? It's kind of a cynical approach, but I really appreciate it. And so that's to the unmarried. Look, don't look for somebody that's going to fulfill you. Look for somebody that you can serve God with and that's going to have that sense of commitment as the foundation to the marriage. Not looking for a back door out, because then you'll be forced to work out the issues as they arise. To the married, I came across, under Marianne's, Dr. Euconis's advice, John Gottman's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Now, this guy says that with a 91% accuracy, he can predict whether or not you're going to get divorced by observing you handle conflict on a 5-minute video. 91%, he says. It was pretty impressive. And he says these are 4 of the key things that when he sees it are main predictors for divorce. So if you're married and you have these, deal with them. Don't engage with them. The first is contempt. That's the idea of looking down on the other person, rolling the eyes and all that. Criticism. That's attacking the person instead of ever dealing with the issue, attacking the person. I've got these outlined a little more in your notes. Defensiveness. That's counterattacking and never accepting responsibility. And stonewalling, that's where it's like, I'm not going to talk to you. We're not going to deal with this. And that can be used to punish the other person. And he says, look, these are the 4 horsemen of the marriage apocalypse. Don't go there. If you're married, avoid these pitfalls and adopt a tenacious, commitment-oriented mindset that will help you work through issues as they arise. In the end, Christian marriage is an intensified form of loving your neighbor as yourself. And it's a lot harder than loving your neighbor a house over, because this person lives in your house and they're not always on their best behavior. That's just when other people are over, right? So that's what I wanted to share about this subject.